Perfect. Hello. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Coffee to Compost, Designing Compostable Coffee Pods for Growing US Industrial Composting Infrastructure. We're happy to have you here. I'm Leah Ford. I lead Global Marketing Communications for NatureWorks, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. So a couple of housekeeping items to get us started. Hopefully you'll see at the right side of your screens, we have a questions panel. Please feel free to submit questions at any time. We'll keep an eye on those. We have a small team of NatureWorks people also watching those in case you run into technical problems throughout the webinar or have a question that might be a little off topic. Otherwise, good questions for the group. We're going to save those for the end for today's speakers. This webinar is also being recorded. We're going to post it to our YouTube channel once we're done so that you can rewatch it or share it with colleagues who weren't able to make it today. After this webinar, you'll also receive an email that'll contain a link to today's slides as well as a short survey. So hopefully you can let us know how these webinars are going. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So we have Flavio Di Marcotullio from NatureWorks. He's a global industry manager for single-serve beverages and compostable films. And we're also happy to welcome Franciosi from the US Composting Council, where he's the executive director, both for the council and for the Compost Council Research and Education Foundation. So thank you both for joining us today. And Flavio, I'm going to make your slides big, and I think we can get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Leah. Thanks for the introduction, and good morning, afternoon, everybody. Here we are again talking about compostable pods today. But before really jumping on it, I think I will take the next 10 minutes to quickly go through some slides that I put together for you today. And I would like to start with this one, which is, I think, a good slide that summarizes quickly how markets have been evolving for us, for NatureWorks, and probably not only for us. We have been working in this market for a very long time now, but we have not just been manufacturing, but really developing application together with our partner. Enjoy is today using broad end markets, and we work pretty hard to stay nimble in this so diversified market. This chart is actually continuously evolving. And if I think about the same chart, maybe only 5 years ago, I can clearly see that there are quite new changes. And think about, application like 3D printing or coffee capsules or even paper coating, non-wovens now for surgical masks, just to mention a few. So this is, I think, also the beauty about being really so much immersed in this market. But as we developed our market, also our thinking around waste has evolved. At the beginning, some people were thinking a little like composting a t-shirt might have been a good idea. But now there are comprehensive framework to understand what impact materials have and what we should really do about that. And so I will be talking about framework because I think that there is no need to really reinvent the wheel. And please, Leah, if you go to the next slide. So yeah, framework. Here you see a couple of examples, and I choose to get 2 recent examples. Here you have on the left-hand side, breaking the plastic wave, and on the right side, an article, a study actually appeared on Nature called Strategies to Reduce Global Carbon Footprint of Plastics. Today, I will spend a few minutes talking about the first framework, breaking the plastic wave, and I will go through some of the main points and findings of this study. This is a really recent study, which was released by Pew Capital Trust and System IQ, and it's called, as you see again, Breaking the Plastic Wave. You can find this online by simply Google it, and it's pretty amazing how many findings they have. It's one of the most amazing one was that today, without an immediate and sustained action, we will the plastic in the ocean will nearly triple by 2040. And when you think about 2030, you might think that it's a long way, but actually it's only 20 years. And if you think what we were doing only 20 years ago, well, that's something, time will go really quick. And they say that there's going to be 29 million metric tons per year in that will end up in the ocean, which is same as 110 pounds or 50 kilograms of plastic on every meter of coastline around the world. And Leah, if you go to the next slide, please. Again, I'm just taking here some of the main findings, as I was saying. And this one, as you can see, is again about the amount of plastic pollution. I think it's important to say that this study is not against plastic, but it's against plastic pollution, which is really different. And breaking the plastic flay found that without immediate and sustained actions, the amount of plastic in the ocean will nearly triple by 2030. So this is, and maybe Leo, you can also jump to the next slide, because I think the other one is even more impressive, because what they say also is that besides the huge effort that we have been seeing, current commitments will reduce the annual plastic flows into the ocean by only 7%. And there is a nice chart that shows it. So really, we see lots of efforts, but they are not enough here if we want to tackle the plastic pollution problem. Next slide, please. So the report uses really different scenario to understand what the impact is from different actions. And there is one scenario called system change, which is kind of the selected scenario. If all the solution applied in this system change scenario are implemented, then we can already reduce by almost 80% the annual flow of plastic waste into the ocean. So this is actually pretty encouraging, thinking that today we have potentially the solution to reduce by 80% by 2040 the plastic pollution. This reduction, of course, will require substantial shifts in all economic sectors, significant new investments, and major policy changes from governments. Next slide, please. These slides summarize what I've just been saying, but is putting some numbers against it. So the impact of the system change scenario, the one I was talking about, is outlined actually in the row below, and it is compared versus what impact you would have. For example, if you do business as usual, first row, collect and dispose only, recycling only, or reduce and substitute only. So the message behind this slide is that we won't recycle or dispose our way out of plastic pollution, meaning that's only if we really take a 360-degree approach, then we will be able to achieve that 80% plastic weight reduction that I was referring before. Next slide. So summarizing a little bit the report, really the point is that there is no single solution. So preventing the vast majority of plastic from entering to the ocean require reducing plastic use, funding substitutes for plastics, improving recycling practices, expanding waste collection, and also ensuring that disposal facilities prevent plastic leakage as a transitional measure, because recycling alone is clearly not the solution. But I think that, and if you go to the next slide, Leah, that's nobody better than Ellen MacArthur could transmit and summarize this key concepts. And so I prefer to put here a 1-minute video. Yes, please go ahead, Leah.
In 2016, our report showed that if we continue with business as usual, there'll be more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. This new Breaking the Plastic Wave study shows that even if we do everything we physically can, every technology deployed that we understand today, we can only reduce the flow of plastic packaging into the ocean by 80% by 2040. That's the next 20 years. But we need to do more. Millions of dollars are being spent on cleaning up beaches, rivers, streets, recycling. But it's not enough, because all that will be in vain if we continue to pour plastic packaging which has no value into the economy. We need to tackle this flood at source. We need to go to the beginning of the system So every piece of plastic that is manufactured has a value. We need to eliminate all the plastic we don't need. We need to innovate for the plastic we do, making sure it is reusable, recyclable and compostable. And importantly, we need to circulate everything we produce, be that plastic or a biological component which replaces it. That's what sits behind the global commitment. This is the vision of the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment, and this is the vision that over 450 organisations, including some of the biggest companies in the world.
So, yeah, hopefully the audio was good for everybody, but again, I thought that Helen was making a way better job than I do in illustrating quickly those key concepts. And she mentions, I think, one key word. She said compostability. And if you move to the next slide, please, Leah, you will find that she was referring to some previous studies that had already been published by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And in particular, if you look at the row where it says nutrient contaminated, so the one down below, and I think, again, we're all familiar with this now, and this shows clearly the ambitious goal that we have when we talk about coffee pods. And it's nutrient contaminated, as we know, packaging. And the solution, as you see on the right-hand side, is to scale up compostable plastics for target application to help recover nutrients of packaging contents. And if we move to the next slide, what I think is really encouraging here is that there is already, and there is even a very fresh, clear demonstration of how some states and countries are now embracing the global commitments that Ellen MacArthur was referring to. These slides that I'm showing here shows that statement made last week by the Ontario Minister of the Environment, Jeff Urek, who announced that the government is now moving forward with the plan to reduce the amounts of food waste that is going to landfills. And they're proposing to change the food and organic waste policy statements. And so what Jeff also stated, and that's what you find in this slide in blue color, is that clarify and expand the type of material that may be collected in municipal green bins and another collection system, including certain compostable products and packaging such as certified compostable coffee pods. So they are really making real commitments now, and that's, I think, where we do see that everything is happening. So it's not just Ellen MacArthur, but it's not just companies, supply chain actors, but also in this case the Minister of the Environment of Ontario. So Leah, if you please go to the next slide. Which again, I think summarizes what I was talking about before. We clearly don't need to wait any longer, because the title of this slide is how can we already impact the future today? And we really don't have to wait any longer. We can start the plastic revolution today. And let me repeat what I already said before. This is not a campaign about eliminating plastic. It's a call for action. And we, as NatureWorks, have decided to dedicate resources to develop certified performing compostable pods and help the industry achieve what is contained in that system change scenario that I was referring to before. And we will be impacting this in many different ways. And as you see in this slide, we will do that by substituting, with redesigning, and with scaling up collection of packaging. And so again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I really suggest you to have a look at this study, which is also, by the way, endorsed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But let me then move on the next slide, which is really about the foundation of all pod elements, where NGO has, I think, the privilege to really be at the core of most of the compostable pods developments that you can find today in the markets. And today you can find NGO in both soft and rigid formats, spanning from tea bags, coffee pads, coffee pods, capsule body, leading material, and fiber filter. And this leads me to the next slide, which you should have already seen. I was showing this also in the previous webinar, and it's about really us designing, together with our partner, a compostable that is compostable, of course, food safe, and allows that best taste experience for the consumer, while making sure that the performance are really there. And when we talk about performance here, I'm referring to eliminating, for example, the use of other polymers, which are bringing associated migration concerns, having developed high heat grades with no aging effects, which are really key in the capsule in the capsule market. Have a fully adjustable and up to 12 and plus months barrier layer to get the required shelf life requirements. And finally, tailor to deliver the ideal cup of coffee, again, to make sure that your coffee, whatever you want to take it, has the maximum quality. And I'm moving to the last slide, please, Leah, which is really just a way to show you where we are today. INGO and NatureWorks, we are at the very beginning of this supply chain. We work closely, thanks to our application development team, to our research and development guys. We work closely with our supply chain partners, and depending on the solution, depending on the capsule type, on the system, we might be working with compounders and with injection molder, with sheet extrusion and thermoformers, or even with continuous compression molding, for example. This is just for the capsule body. When it comes to lidding, you have also different options, but the most habitual is normally film extrusion and lamination. And finally, as I was saying before, with filtering, not just talking about the rigid pod, but also soft pods or tea bags. We have a really supportive industry with whom we work together to develop performing non-woven fabric. And this all together can bring turnkey solution to roasters that are willing to develop. So this was my last slide. I will pause here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, actually to getting back to you at the end of Frank's presentation. And I will let you, Leah, introduce Frank. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Flavio. I appreciate it. So yeah, Frank, if you're able to share your screen and your slides.
First of all, thanks for inviting me, Flavio. And I really love to talk about this topic, and that's composting and composting infrastructure in the U.S. Just really briefly overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the US Composting Council, who we are, what we do. I'll talk a little bit about composting in general, both the scale and the different methods, so people have a little bit of a better understanding of what type of composting methods are out there. And then I'm going to talk about what's driving infrastructure in the US, and then also what's hindering it. What are the obstacles and hurdles that we have to overcome to get more of a sustainable growth in infrastructure for composting. And then talk about overcoming those hurdles, what the US Composting Council is doing, and really what the listeners could possibly do to help us with our mission. So next slide.
Really good at sharing the first slide, but advancing it is it's getting me angry. So sorry about that. Try one more time.
This is Murphy's Law, right? I mean,
definitely, especially these days.
I practiced this yesterday and this morning with no glitches, and now we have glitches.
Exactly. That's all right. We'll be fast. Quick on the draw here. Try one more time. There we go.
Good.
Perfect.
So I'm not going to bore people about the US Composting Council. I'll go through these pretty quick. We've been around for a while, and we're really the voice of the industry here in the US. Originally started back in 1990 in Minnesota as the Municipal Solid Waste Composting Council, and then changed our names to the US Composting Council. Next slide. This is our mission and our vision. Fabio talked a little bit about end of life. We're all about returning carbon and nutrients back to the soil where they belong. and really establishing a circular economy and a sustainable environment for both our climate as well as our water and our society. Next slide. So these are the areas of engagement that the US Compost Council is engaged in. And a lot of this has to do with our organization is very much a membership-driven organization. And we're really promoting composting in general and also compost use pretty much on all levels. Next slide. So these are the committees of the US Composting Council. As I said before, a lot of our membership volunteers on these committees have done a remarkable job of really moving our industry forward in different areas. And one area that I'll talk about later that's really pertinent to what this presentation is about is the Target Organics Committee, and it has to do with really targeting municipalities to really start thinking about how to source separate their organics and how to grow those programs within their communities. Next slide. So in 2019, the board of directors met and revised our strategic plan. We basically looked at 5 areas of growth. Our membership, again, is one of our most important commodities that we'd like to make sure that our programs are really representative of what the membership wants and the value of membership. Advocacy is huge, as you all know, when it comes to public policy at all levels, from the municipal level, state level, and national level. So we're putting an emphasis on advocacy, and mainly at the state level, we're growing our state chapter system. And we're really excited about that because we feel that's where we can make the greatest impact when it comes to policy. Of course, you've got to have 2 ends of the composting facility, the material coming in and then the compost going out. So growing more markets for compost and compost products, again, is another strategic goal of ours. And just developing the industry in general, becoming more professional, certifying operators, certifying product, and then involving new technologies so we can streamline what we're currently doing and just be more efficient at what we do. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about composting scale and methods. Next slide. So those of you who are familiar with home composting or backyard composting, and I'm not trying to downplay any of these methods, I think, or any of these scales. I think they all have their purpose, but in certain instances, when you're looking at large volumes, scale is important. Most of us know home composting. I certainly home compost myself. There's a lot of nice little, things you can buy on eBay and Amazon that are backyard composting. The biggest problem with these issues are there's just, if you go back one, there's just not enough thermal mass to get the heat in those particular backyard units. The average homeowner is not going to tend to them on a regular basis. They're too wet, they're too dry. There's not enough air. There's all sorts of issues with airspace and porosity. So it's not an exact science in backyard composting. It's also called cold composting. You don't generate the heats, mainly because you're not really tending to it on a regular basis. I do know people that have excellent backyard composting systems and do this themselves. But again, it's not as practical and not the situation when you're looking at something like composting, for example, the coffee capsules. Next slide. So community composting is kind of a scale up, and this could be in urban farms. It could be community drop-off centers. It could be a curbside collection or house-to-house collection with composters that are actually more haulers than they are composters. Again, the big issue here is this stuff being attended on a regular basis? What are the local ordinances for these? Can you scale up? Usually most municipalities are limiting the amount of tons that a facility like this would take. So the last area is medium to, you can go to the next slide, Leah. So the last one is medium to large scale or centralized composting. And this is what we're more familiar with at the US Composting Council. A lot more volume per year. We see mega facilities like the one to the right, which is Cedar Grove composting in Seattle. And you're talking, 3 to 400, maybe even 500 tons per year of processing. And then, smaller mid-sized municipalities that are also, composting a significant amount of materials. Next slide. So what are the methods of composting? There's pilot and let it rot, which is basically the static pile. You see a lot of this in small communities where they have yard waste drop off. They're grinding the material, piling it up, and basically they're not really actively composting it, kind of letting it break down on its own. Next slide. So there's aerated static pile, almost the same concept, but here it's really important that you have a really good porous material. And you see in these pictures the piping where there's a blower system and they're forcing air into the piles on intervals, depending on whether there's feedback through temperature feedback, thermocouples, or just on and off for periods of time. Some of these are covered, some of them are not, but this speeds up the process. And a lot of this also is done where the exhaust is headed to a biofilter. So you have less odor problems. A lot of the nasty, smelly volatile organics get drawn off, and the microbes eat those pretty quick. You get high temperatures very quick. Next slide. Turn windrow composting, which is probably the most prevalent here in the U.S., and you see a lot of this in yard waste facilities across the U.S. You can incorporate other materials like manures, biosolids, or food waste. You get the thermal mass here. It's definitely one of the more popular ways of doing it. A lot more land mass that you're going to use here versus aerated static pile. And so a lot of facilities use a combination of both. They'll start out with an aerated static pile, and then they'll move to a turn windrow to finish their compost off. Next slide. Turned aerated static pile. This is kind of unique. This facility picture here that you see is in Phoenix, Arizona. And the piping is underground, under concrete, which there's conduit. And they're actually doing both. They're aerating and they're also turning as well. So that's a different method. You don't see a lot of that, but another one to mention. Next slide. In vessel, you'll see these at small scale, large scale. A lot of these you'll see in small scale, like at a university or a dining hall, where they're handling food scrap waste. They're agitated usually. They usually have airflow to them, and they also go to a biofilter. And they don't really finish off the compost completely, but again, they draw off all those nasty volatile organic compounds and give you a pretty much an unmature compost that you would need to cure out before you could use it or sell it. Next slide. Agitated bay. You don't see as many of these. They were kind of popular in the 90s with biosolid facilities, kind of the same concept of the aerated and turn. They're usually in a building. You'll see them where there's slotted floors, thermal couplers, and they're highly engineered, let's just say it that way, but highly controlled also, so that the end product is very consistent. Next slide. So we're talking about coffee pods today, right? So everybody wants to know, like, out of that coffee pod, how much of that is coffee? So Flavio talked a little bit earlier about compostable products in general. Composters, they want compostable products that are going to bring in food scrap. So here's a really good example. 82% of a pod is spent coffee, right? Coffee fines. So that's a value to the compost that benefits the finished product. And it brings in weight. Composters get paid by what crosses their scales, and so a wet coffee pod is going to weigh a lot more than something like a piece of compostable paper, for example. So just a thought process there also is, you're returning this back to the earth, to grow plant materials. So you're closing the loop. Next slide. So what's driving compost here in the U.S.? And I'll touch on all of these in different slides. So next slide. So we have some international drivers with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Also USDA, EPA have put together some goals to reduce. And then we have also an independent agency called ReFed. And all of these agencies are involved in reducing food waste in general across the board. Next slide. So nationally, and this is right from ReFed report, composting, when we look at composting, we don't look at the food waste that can be fed to people or animals. We look at foods, what we call food scrap. So food scrap, 5.3 million tons of food scrap could be diverted from landfills to composting. And that impact would reduce 2.8 million tons of greenhouse gases and also creating 9,000 jobs. So from a municipal standpoint, a state standpoint, a policy standpoint, it makes perfect sense that this material goes to composting facilities and return back to the earth. EPA did a recent survey in 2020, 27 million tons of compost are composted each year in the US. Again, the majority of that is yard waste trimming, but we are seeing a growth in food scrap with 2.8 million tons of food scraps being composted. Next slide, please. So the other issue is state drivers. So we're seeing states, across the US starting to mandate or ban organics from landfills. You're seeing obviously the West Coast, and then there's also municipalities as well, like Seattle, Boulder, Colorado, Austin, Texas, that have created programs where there's curbside collection, and they've banned they've banned organics in general from going into the landfill. And then the Northeast states, there's a cluster up there, and the drivers there are really high landfill costs, because a lot of these states don't have landfills. So they're shipping material, the transportation costs are very high. A lot of states have banned incineration. So as we all know, organics is the largest weight of the waste stream. So it just makes, again, perfect sense to put together organic bans within these states. So that's another driver. Where we've seen bans initially in our industry, when, back in the early 90s, yard waste bans really started the composting industry. So we're seeing that the stick works along with the carrot as well. We'd like to see incentives for these states, that they offer incentives for either compost use or for helping infrastructure growth within those states. Next slide. This is from Biocycle back in 2017, and just showing the difference between 2013 and 2017. You see more increase in programs, doubling the programs, almost doubling of the number of communities, and you're seeing not a very big increase in states, but just a huge increase in number of households. And I believe this study is probably going to happen again this year, so we'll be able to compare those numbers as well. But this slide just shows you that there is an increase across the U.S. in curbside collection programs on a residential level. Next slide. So the other thing, and this is kind of what I call a great place to start for municipalities, and that's drop-off programs. And if you could prove your concept on small drop-off programs and then eventually go to curbside collection, it's a good way to do that. It's, prove your concept, get all your wrinkles out of the system, and then move up the line to more of a get the public used to separating the organics. Really important. So you see an increase here, and I hope that the next time we do the survey, we see a doubling or a tripling effect of these drop-off programs. Next slide. So what's the other state driver? And Flavio actually touched on this earlier. We're seeing a lot of backlash for single-use plastic across the country and municipalities and states with regulation on the use of single-use plastic. And I'm also seeing in that language compostables and what they are, how they're defined, and how they should be used and how they should be mandated. So a lot of effect here is coming is good in a way that there's some backlash on the single-use plastic going to landfill and not being able to be recycled. But we have to keep in mind that we want to be at the table here when they're talking about compostable products and how they specify those products and the requirements for those products. Next slide, please. So the consumer, you know, everybody that saw the turtle with the straw or the whale that they cut open with plastic in it, people do not want plastic. You go to a restaurant now and they don't just automatically give you a plastic straw. They ask you whether you want a straw, and sometimes that straw is compostable, and sometimes that straw is paper also. So I personally don't use straws. But I think the consumer there is really concerned. I think they don't want landfills in their backyards. They're starting to think about future generations. The consumer does not like greenwashing. That's a no-no. So we're seeing pressure from the consumer side to make our products more cradle to cradle and not just cradle to grave. Next slide. So the shareholder, that's the other pressure that we're seeing. A lot of individuals are not investing in companies unless they have a sustainability program, they have a sustainability record and a track record, and they're actually doing something, they're not greenwashing. So we're seeing shareholders demand that companies be more sustainable. And let's face it, waste is money lost. So any companies that can, you know, cut their waste are saving money in the long run, both from an economic standpoint as well as an ecological standpoint. So next slide, please. So compost product, yes, people say, oh, I've got all this compost, I don't know what to do with it. So getting back to earlier about what Flavio talked about, contamination, if you can produce a high quality compost product, there is a huge demand for it. And some of the growing areas are in green infrastructure with stormwater management and landscape design for sustainability and resiliency in communities where you have combined sewer flow, like New York City, Philadelphia, Atlanta. You have issues with the stormwater surge that goes directly to the wastewater treatment plant. And when that happens during an extreme storm event, the wastewater treatment plant has to let that go. So they let the combined flow of sewage and stormwater go. Where green infrastructure comes in is capturing those storm events and holding that water back. And a lot of compost is used in green roofs, bioretention basins, and infiltration zones throughout urban areas and suburban areas. When you look at parks now, parks are really green infrastructures. Greenways are green infrastructures. So there's a huge demand for it. But again, quality is very much important when you're looking at marketing a compost product. Next slide, please. So what's the hurdles to infrastructure growth? And I'll go through all of these in each slide. Next slide, please. So this one's a biggie, and I think this is where I think everyone needs to be involved, all the stakeholders, and I think this is where brand companies can really help out our industry, and that is, you know, getting the public to really understand what compost is, and then, you know, how to source separate organics at the point of generation to try to reduce the contamination rate. A lot of that has to do with clear labeling on products, making sure that we have some public service announcements that are out there, kind of like going back to, and I'm dating myself right now, the Crying Indian back in the 1970s, and that's what we need as an industry, and as all the stakeholders within our industry. We need to get together, and we need to put together that message and make sure that message is clear and start changing the way we do things. It's definitely something that we all have to work on, and we all need to contribute to. Next slide. So state permitting, that's another hurdle. A lot of states don't have composting regulations, or they only have yard waste regulations. They don't have food scrap in there or source separation in there. Some of the agencies are multi-permitting. So an example is California. It takes you 5 to 7 years to get a permit, and you have to go through 5 different agencies to get 5 different permits. In North Carolina, you go to one agency to get 1 permit, and you could probably do it in a year, maybe a year and a half. So what we really need here is more of modeled template regulations, which the USCC started back in 2012, and we're starting to work towards revising those as well. So if we can get smoother, more streamlined permitting regulations, and then on the legislation side, on the policy side, what about the yard waste bans and the organics bans? We need to see more of those throughout the country. Next slide. So zoning is a big thing too. A lot of people do not want a composting facility in their backyard. Is it agricultural? Is it industrial? Is it manufacturing? So what we're trying to do here is, again, look at zoning in general across the board, and where does composting fit within the zoning plan, whether it be in a rural area or an urban area. Next slide, please. Contamination, this is one of the big issues. And again, I think it gets back to, educating the consumer, making sure that compostable products are labeled and identified properly. And then if they are, make sure that plastic material doesn't have lookalikes. We don't want lookalikes out there because as a compost manufacturer, it's really, really important to be able to identify these products coming in so you can see what is actually contaminating the compost on the back end, and also what is actually compostable. Next slide, please. Financing, as you know, is a big issue, particularly now with COVID in municipalities. It's hard to find funds. So we need to figure out really what's the best way to do that. How do we get private venture capitalists involved in composting infrastructure? We're seeing an increase in that. There's a lot of activity in that area. And then also, what about how to fund it? Can we fund it through taxes or tariffs on fees, on landfill fees? I know a lot of that has been done in the past with recycling. Can that be done with organics as well? The industry itself does not have a North American industry classification code. Right now, we're lumped under an SIC code that's very old, and we're considered fertilizer mixing operations. I can tell you now that we don't mix fertilizer, and a lot of composting facilities do not sell their product as fertilizer. They don't register it as fertilizer. They register it as a soil additive or a soil amendment. Next slide, please. So how do we overcome these hurdles? And the USCC is really developing that roadmap to success and trying to look at each one of these hurdles and to develop resources and toolkits around how to get around these hurdles. Next slide. So I talked earlier about municipalities and how important they are. And the USCC about 2 years ago formed a committee called the Target Organics Committee, which really has evolved into the Target Organics project, excuse me. And what that is involved in is getting municipalities to start thinking about source separating their materials. If you think about solid waste in general, it all happens on the local level. And that's where the flow is. That's where the zoning is. That's where the land use is. So they control a lot of the issues that we can overcome, a lot of those hurdles that I talked about earlier, by getting them involved in up front and stop thinking about kicking the can down the road and building another landfill, but start thinking about source separating their organics, creating local jobs, creating a local product, and having that product available that's going to help the environment from a climate mitigation standpoint, as well as a stormwater management standpoint. Next slide. So when you look at how municipalities handle solid waste, they have a solid waste plan. They hire a consulting firm. They look at their volumes, residential, commercial. They look at, 5-10 years down the road. What's my population growth rate? What's my makeup of my MSW? How much of that is organic? How much of it can I recycle? And then they calculate their landfill life, and they say, okay, well, based on your population growth and your commercial growth and your current volume and your mix, your landfill is only going to last you another 5 years. You better start thinking about building another landfill. And that landfill is now 40 miles outside the facility, the local jurisdiction, versus being in-house. So literally you're kicking down the can down the road. So what we're trying to do is, this is the point of inflection. This is where we get Target Organics in to our communities to have them start thinking about really what needs to be done with organics and not landfilling it. Next slide, please. So these are the projects that the deliverables for the next 3 years that the Target Organics project is looking at. And as you see, a lot of these deliverables are things that we addressed earlier in what those hurdles were. And how do we put together that toolkit, and how we put together that roadmap is really going to be called the Target Organics Hub. And as you can see, there's a lot of information here. And we're working on it right now. And we're really pleased that a lot of these things that we talked about are in play. I'm happy to report that we worked with BPI and other stakeholders on the labeling and identification of compostable products. We're working on the model rules template. The zoning part is almost ready to get released. Hopefully we'll have that released by the end of the year. And there's a lot of other things that you see in these projects that we've either started or they're ready to be completed. Next slide. So where all this stuff gets housed, again, when I talked about the very beginning, the committees of the USCC, along with the foundation, has taken on these projects, and they're actively working these to get these to a completion point within the total organics, Target Organics Hub. Next slide, please. So how do we fund all this, right? And about a year ago, we came up with the concept of a corporate compost leadership council. I'm happy to report that NatureWorks is involved in this, both on a committee level as well as also as help funding it. And really, this is really where we get brand companies involved in helping us get those deliverables completed over the next 3 years. Next slide. So this group meets quarterly. We talk about the issues, how we can develop these deliverables, what can they do for us as far as in-kind services like marketing or funding, and then also how they can prioritize those deliverables. A lot of these companies have research and development departments, marketing departments, graphic design, and also have ties to advocacy. So when these deliverables do get finished, how do we get them to market? How do we get people to really start using these tools? Next slide. So, where's the engagement of these brand companies? Again, shaping consumer behavior, I think, is one of the most important things that they can help us in doing, promoting the policy changes and debottlenecking all these hurdles within the infrastructure growth. And then, getting recognition for doing that. I mean, we want to give credit where credit is due. And I think that our main goal is taking compost mainstream and encouraging municipalities really to invest more in composting and not in landfilling. Next slide. This is just the list of the current members at the different levels that we have investing. As you can see, We have just started, but we've got some pretty big brand names up there. We hope to grow this program, and if anybody is really interested in hearing more about it, be happy to talk to them about it. And then the last slide, I believe. There you go. And there's my shameful ad to come to our virtual Compost 2021 conference in January.
Oh, that's great. You always have to promote the conference. So thank you, Frank. Really appreciate you sharing that information. And it's very cool to see the growth in composting infrastructure in the US and what the Target Organics program and the Corporate Compost Leadership Council are seeking to accomplish to accelerate that. So looks like there's a lot of really good stuff to come, which is really great. So now Flavio is back online, as am I. And so we'd like to get to the Q&A portion of today's webinar with the time that we have left. So please feel free to submit your questions via the questions panel on the right, and we will get to them. And I have a few questions myself as well. So we can start with some of the things that have come in. For example, we have a question for you, Frank. In single sort organics, I'm guessing that's what SSO is. Hopefully I got that right.
Source separated organics.
Source separated, sorry. In the source separated organics composting facility, how would they handle the composting of coffee pods? Would it be lumped in with food waste, or would it be its own waste stream?
Well, I mean, unless it's like a coffee shop, then that's all they do is single serve, capsules, which is probably unusual. I would say it probably would be mixed in with other food waste. If it's a curbside collection program for residential, then it would be mixed in with the food waste. I don't see any instances where it would be. There was a concept earlier that maybe that some of these pods where there's no composting, some of these pods would be dropped back off where they're purchased, like at the grocery store. And just like you used to bring back your milk bottles. Again, I'm dating myself here, but that would be a single source right there. It wouldn't have to be separated.
Okay, great. We have another question. Let's see. For you, Frank, how do you certify a product as compostable when centralized composting facilities each have different methods, conditions on how they treat compost material?
That's a tough one. The best way to do that, is kind of figure out the common denominators, and that is, just because it works in a lab doesn't mean it's going to break down in a facility. So, one of the things that we're recommending is either field testing it through a third-party system, or getting the composter that's involved himself in testing it out. Again, prove your concept on a small scale, and then because composting facilities operate differently for a number of reasons. The methods, like I talked about earlier, will determine that. Your mixes, what's coming in the front end, how you monitor, and then your economic model. Or is your economic model to turn material out very quickly and try to get it out of market so I could get more stuff in the front door, or is it more that you're going to sell a mature compost, a high standard compost? It's not an easy question, and we hope that with better labeling and better and field testing, and we find the answers, we find those happy mediums, and then we can get that information back to the producers that are making the products so they can understand, and maybe they can better design the products as well.
Awesome. Let's see here. On the state permitting and legislation slide, you have legislation, no yard waste ban and no organics ban. What is meant by this legislation?
Well, in some states, we're seeing yard waste bans trying to get overturned, and a lot of that is a grab for that feedstock to go back into landfills. We saw some of this with COVID. They're just like, oh, just put all the recyclables, yard waste, put everything back in one container, and we'll just come and pick it up once. And that's some of that's happening there. So I would say the majority of, I think there's 27 something states that have yard waste bans, but some of them are trying to overthrow those bans. And then, we would like to see more organic waste bans for food scrap, for example, and see that increase. But we're proponents of not only having a mandate, but also having some incentives. You need the carrot as well as the stick here, because I feel for municipalities, because all of a sudden they're mandated to do something and they have no funding to do it. So we have to work with municipalities to figure out, how do we fund that? How do they get incentivized by doing that? And maybe you'll see more of it happening.
Okay, that leads really well into another question, which is, what are the incentives or drivers for composters to accept compostable materials?
Well, one thing is just volume in general, increasing the amount of volume that's coming in versus, being into another market. Now, a lot of composters are, taking what I call low-hanging fruit, and that is, straight produce waste where you don't have a lot of contamination and stuff like that. But those materials, they may dry up. You may not get those materials. And then I think, to me, everything that touches food and food packaging, should be, compostable. So it makes it easier for us to, particularly package products and stuff that goes out of date. We either depack it, which is an issue, which is another cost, or we make them all compostable and easy to compost in a facility.
Okay. Excellent. Has the USCC thought about guidelines or a list of all coffee compostable products and brands that composting facilities could share with existing and potential customers?
We don't do any of the testing ourselves. It's the field testing. So there are independent groups that can do that. The Compost Manufacturers Alliance is one of them. And then also the foundation has just started a field testing program as well. So we don't third-party certify compostables. That's not something, I know some of the other councils across the world do that as well. They have an internal program. So we don't do that. We always recommend, number one, it should be BPI certified. Number two, it should be field tested. Really field tested in the facility that you're going to send it to. That's really, to me, a better way of making sure that material is going to get there, be composted in a proper manner.
Okay. Since coffee pods are normally white PLA and composting has some heat drivers in order to get efficiency, with the white let's see if I can read this right. With the white reflectivity, more heat is needed, hence more energy. Is there any thought process in driving out the white for clear packaging? Maybe a better question for Flavio.
Yeah, that's a Flavio question.
So they wrote so.
No, yeah, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not really able to answer on the reflectivity point. But I think what we do see in the market today is that not all PLA based compostable pods to be actually white. We do see actually customers developing also non-white, I would say, capsules. So I would say that there is no standard with white. Frank, I don't know if you're able to answer on the reflectivity points. Maybe you are.
Yeah, I don't think it's an issue. I mean, the one thing that, and I guess, when you were going over that schematic on how they were all put together, the one thing that I was thinking is you're almost working like against two different deltas. You have a capsule that you want, you have high heat so you can express that coffee out, right? And then I would imagine by doing so, you make that capsule, now it's porous, right? You couldn't like reuse that capsule, right? So now
right.
You've kind of shot holes in it, right? So it should make it more compostable. If you took a straight pod that you didn't run anything through it, right off the shelf and put it in a composting facility, it'd probably take a lot longer than something that has been expressed.
And I can confirm that we did some studies in Europe, and we actually were testing both, non-brewed capsules pods and brewed ones. And the brewed ones, because exactly what you're saying, basically have been in contact with heat, but also the coffee, now has plenty of water. So it clearly is a kind of a kick for the composting process to start. So yeah, which is the beauty. And actually, we've been designing our capsules to make sure, that the consumer finally could have end a compostable capsule that was working perfectly in the composting facilities. Absolutely.
Excellent. I know we're kind of at time, but there are two really good questions that I think have short answers that I'd love to get to, if that's okay with you guys.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
One question is, are there any guidelines to distinguish between compostable and biodegradable?
Ooh. You want to handle that one?
Well, I think the easy one is that compostable is you can certify a product as compostable. So, and as we are talking, and you also saw that the framework I was referring to are talking about certified compostable capsules. So, by definition, as I think we are all only thinking about certified capsules, we immediately have the idea of compostability, which has to meet some standards, as we all know. Plus, and you guys are more expert than I am, but I know that in some states like California, it's actually forbidden to use the biodegradable word, meaning that if you don't want to to be fined, for example, you will need to use the compostable wording. In that case, again, you will need to make sure that your capsule is actually certified. That would be how I look at it. I don't know, Frank.
Yeah, I would. Same thing here. Often they're used interchangeably. They shouldn't be. I always tell people, radioactive waste is biodegradable. It just takes 25,000 years. So everything's biodegradable, right? It all eventually will break down, but so I don't even use that word. It's compostable that we talk about. Yep.
Yeah, and let me also add that as we work together with the supply chain partners and also brands, we try, to really guide and make sure that we all follow those guidelines and that's really those schemes to make sure that the products that are finally in the market, at least those that are done with our collaboration, are certified compostable, and so there should be no doubt. But it's a good question indeed.
Okay. What impact do compostable coffee capsules have when they enter the landfill rather than an industrial composting facility? And how does that compare to aluminum or non-compostable plastics?
I mean, in a landfill, you don't have air. It's the absence of air. So you have anaerobic, digestion. I don't know if Flavio, if they've done any studies on anaerobic, within a landfill. I would imagine that, without the biological activity, the bacteria, and active thermophilic bacteria are aerobic, and they actually break down that plastic, the plant-based plastic that's in there. So I can't speak to what happens in a landfill other than, I know that there's pictures of people taking, newspaper out of landfills that have been, entombed for the 1930s, and you can still read the headlines. So that tells me that nothing breaks down in a landfill at all.
That's true. And at NatureWorks, we've done some studies on accelerated conditions for NGO in a landfill to show that it's effectively inert in a landfill as well. So frankly, nothing will happen in a landfill. It's a lost opportunity, perhaps.
Exactly.
So
maybe another question I see from Predis, Leah. Maybe you can take that one.
Would a home compostable certified single-serve product be approved, accepted in industrial compost facilities?
Okay, so I will ask this to you, Frank, but I would add to this question, so provided, that compostable capsule is performing again, in line with expectation, because that's also what the risk that we see that, and we dedicated a webinar last time. It's okay, are we able to have a performing capsule that is, compostable, and regardless if it's home or not. So that's I think the point. But I'm also curious to hear your point regarding certification in this case, specific in North America.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, home composting is so variable. If it breaks down in a home composter, it should break down in an industrial composting. That's my initial thought on it, because of the higher heats and and it's something that's managed on a regular basis, where you have, operators looking at moisture, oxygen, temperatures and stuff like that, where the homeowner is not doing it. So, I know that in other countries, they're looking at home compostable as a certification and working on an ASTM standard for that. I think it's going to be very difficult to do. I really do. Hope they do. Hope they get it, because that's just another avenue for end of life.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you both for speaking today. We really appreciate it. Again, for our attendees, we've recorded this webinar and it'll be posted to our YouTube channel shortly. And you should all see a follow-up email that'll have a link to today's slides, as well as a short survey to ask us how we did. So Frank and Flavio, anything to add?
No, I just hope I get good grades. That's all.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.